a normal process for any victim of any crime would be to either go to the police or to take some civil action. With the Catholic Church, it's almost impossible to take civil action.
Why is that? Just for those who aren't familiar with that, just explain why that's the case.
Well, the Church is structured in such a way that they have very little legal liability, or they're able to deny legal liability to victims. There are a series of property trusts which is set up in such a way that the Church is not responsible in many cases for what happens on their property.
Most people would find that extraordinary, that a business could structure itself, an enterprise could structure itself in such a way, using property trusts, that all of their assets, their funds, their investments are tucked away on one side, and the outfit, the company, the organisation that employs the priests, most of whom do a good job, but in this case the few who do an appalling criminal actions, are separately employed by an organisation which has negligible assets and from whom you could get no compensation even if you were successful.
Well, that's right. And because of that, victims are very limited what they can do civilly. So what happens is that they're then channelled back to the Church, and they have to take part in a process which the Church has established and which the Church has limited the amount of compensation they'll pay and the amount of care that they will provide.
And it's offered in that respect by the Church, and they can funnel people into the Church and that process because people have a knowledge that they won't be able to succeed at law because they can't get these assets. So the Church takes the position, you come through our process because we're offering you a gratuity. This is a gratuitous payment which you wouldn't otherwise be able to achieve because you couldn't get our assets through civil litigation. So we're doing you a favour by allowing you to come through this conciliation process that we've set up, because legally you'd get nothing, as if they're doing you a favour by offering that gratuitous path.
Well, that's right, and they put it up as a compensation system, whereas in fact it turns out to be an ex gratia payment with no admission of any liability whatsoever. And it's very limited, and it's limited to a point that the Church is able to manage financially. And because of that, there really is no consequences for the Church from what has happened. And because there are no consequences, they're not changing their ways, and there is no transparency to the system, there's no oversight to the system. It's an absolutely opaque system that everyone is told that, trust us, we're doing the right thing. Well, they're not doing the right thing. There must be a state government inquiry into this, and it must become transparent and open.
So the various aspects to this include a much more systematic, transparent, quick and prompt, a just way of dealing with the criminal complaints when they arise in the first instance, a transparent monitoring of that process the whole way through, transparency of outcomes in respect of that. That's the criminal side of things. Then on the other side, you've got civil compensation, proper, fair, just and appropriate civil compensation that doesn't rely on some ex gratia payment. Then there's another layer, and that's symbolic admissions, and that includes laicizing priests, whether it's the Christian Brothers or the Church itself, basically saying, we've got someone who under our watch, under our faith, under our spiritual system, conducted these crimes. We're going to separate ourselves from those individuals. In fact, we've got the exact opposite at the moment, absolute reluctance to want to remove those priests from their position of ordained priesthood. In the case of the Christian Brothers, we had Brother Brandon saying, we're disinclined to expel this Christian brother who was a pedophile from our order. For what possible reason? I want you to just talk briefly about the impact on victims and on families and friends of victims of the Church retaining those formal relations with their pedophile brothers and priests.
Well, having met with the best victims this week, and with our own experience of O'Donnell, who still rests in a Catholic crypt at the Melbourne Cemetery, it's just obscene, and it just further damages the victims to think that their perpetrator, the person who raped them as a grade 3-year-old or whatever, is still allowed to be honoured by the Church. It just makes the whole thing worse. And for some twisted reason, the Church is able to complain that, or to claim that they're somehow doing us a favour by still honouring these people. It's just obscene. That shouldn't be happening.
The most twisted logic I've heard on this is that when these priests, who are convicted pedophiles, emerge from prison, most of whom never will, emerge from prison, that if we retain them as priests, as ordained priests, we'll look after them and save the state, the public, the cost of housing and feeding these pedophiles. They could do that if they were minded to do that without the person retaining the collar around their neck. They could separate that person, they could defrock or laicise them, they could kick him out of the order, and then if in addition to do that, which they ought to do, they wanted to house them, feed them, put them up, whatever they wanted to do with them, they could do that without the person retaining the title of a priest or a Christian brother.
Precisely.
Exactly.
To me, it smacks of a blatant, public, outright extension of the cover-up that's occurred over the last 50, 100 millennia.
When you heard of the sentencing of this brother Best, as a Christian brother, you're not directly involved in this case, but you have a deep interest in these sorts of matters. He got 11 years. You heard the stories about it. We just played before. One of the victim's lawyers, Dr. Vivian Waller, recounting the story of one of her clients who was molested by him as a third grader. Terrible story, but there were many like that. What was your reaction to his sentencing, 11 years?
Well, it was actually 14 years, 9 months.
With a non-parole period.
A non-parole period of 11-9. So most of the victims were content with that, because after all, the sentencing is only a very small part of what's happened to them, and it's not going to bring their lives back. We met each of those victims this week, and they have had horrific lives. To hear their stories, to hear in court and to hear over a beer later what had happened to these guys was just horrific. To see how their lives have been damaged, to, in many cases, to see what wonderful people they were, to imagine what they would have been if this hadn't happened to them. It's just horrific. Now, no matter what sentence Best had, would not bring their lives back, and they understand that. But they were relatively content with what had been achieved, particularly given his age. Chances are he won't get out of prison alive.
Will you get an inquiry?
We'll get an inquiry, of course we will.
You confident?
We are. We have to be. And we have to be for thousands of Victorians who've been abused by the Catholic system, by a Catholic system that segments itself, pretends that the Archdiocese of Melbourne is separate to the Archdiocese of Ballarat. We have to bring the church together under one inquiry as the church in Victoria, and that definition of church will include the Christian Brothers, the Archdiocese of Melbourne, the Diocese of Ballarat. We have to get rid of the obscene situation where Bishop Connors in Ballarat can claim that he had no responsibility for Best. He doesn't want to talk about Best because he's a Christian brother. The Christian Brothers provided the schooling for his students. Now, we have to bring the church together and bring them to account under one inquiry led by the state of Victoria. And Victoria's laws have to become paramount over canon law, this obscene idea that canon law overrides state law.
Anthony and Christy Foster, we wish you well on this. You've taken one giant step by meeting the Attorney-General, an hour-and-a-half meeting. We want to continue to push this as far as we can assist you. Keep going. This is important. It's not like the church exists outside the state. They receive the benefit of tax exemptions. They pay no taxes. They pay no stamp duty. They like all faiths. We support them. Every road they use, every piece of infrastructure they use, they don't pay for. We pay for it. They're exempt from everything. We have a greater public interest in this organisation than most others. They need to be more accountable to the public than almost any other organisation, and they're not. We wish you well.
Thanks, Steve.
Steve Weiss.